This is a different kind of panel. We're calling this designing security from the ground up. And it's kind of literally just that concept of maybe you got a new job and you're stepping in and you're trying to figure out, well, where do we focus? MITRE workshop, we kind of talked about a trifecta of where do I, what do I focus on? But that was too tailored. This is more broad. Do we need EDR? Do we need firewalls? Well, network firewalls, host firewalls. What about cloud? What about containers? What about people management? There's a security aspect to that. And so if we were starting from scratch, what would we focus on? And you all can throw things out. Virtual folks, you can too. Again, my personal styles, if it's a good question, we'll get it asked. And if I don't like it, I will politely ignore it. So, all right.
Sounds good.
So I guess just out of curiosity, as employees of companies, as consultants doing like assessments and stuff, what are some areas that you guys think need more focus than what we talk about? And I mention that because we've had a lot of good talks at the summit. I don't know if anything in particular would be something like I would hit the ground running as this is what I need to focus on now. What are your thoughts? Anybody?
So I would say a lot of the built-in stuff, security controls that you can enable, right? Either by, for example, pushing some type of GPO or just enabling a registry key, something that it's free and is powerful, and how you can set it up in first, like in audit mode, for example, and allows you to explore your environment first and see like where you need to tweak some of those controls. So one of the things that we talked about a little bit was the ASR rules, right? The attack surface reduction rules, and how that's very powerful.
How many of you are using attack surface reduction rules out of curiosity?
Nobody.
Okay,
Oh,
let me rephrase this. How many of you even know what they are?
Yeah.
Okay, how many of you have heard of them? Okay, that's we get more hands as we go up that, and that's kind of interesting because you're really talking about basic free hygiene within the endpoint ecosystem.
That's correct. That's correct. And especially, going in different versions of Windows, even 10 to 11, there is a lot of even new capabilities that are enabled by default. So trying to understand those new capabilities, getting familiarized with those, I think would be a good first step. Sometimes we try to go directly to deploy the latest and greatest and most expensive thing because your partner, company partner in the industry is using it. But and usually what is free and available, in my opinion, is hidden under it's too complex, when you just have to really dive into that a little bit. So spend some time on that. I think it would be a good first thing that I would do in my environment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I went through an exercise a couple of years back where we didn't have, expensive tooling to block outbound traffic, and I just went in Windows Firewall and said, PowerShell's not allowed out to the internet. It's free, easy, and it stopped a lot of stuff.
So again, I don't want to make assumptions here. So I'm already hitting time. You said you blocked PowerShell out to the internet for free. How the heck did you do that?
It's a group policy
Of
Windows Firewall rules. Yes.
Firewall rule, PowerShell.exe,
That's true.
outbound to the internet, block at the endpoint. It's a very simple trick. Really, it's a trick, right? Drop that in place. And it's kind of funny because not only does that prevent that type of attack, not all of it, right? But someone directly using PowerShell out of the blocked. But if you're also doing logging, you also now detected it. Boom, boom. So
Two things for free. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
I mean, I like the concept of hygiene, and I don't feel this applies just to Windows. Like, let's give some Linux or even Mac some love. What are some things built in? I don't care who. I was just pointing at Eugene. What are things even on like a Linux or Mac operating system we could do to live off the land and kind of get a feel for things?
I mean, Audit D's there.
That's what
Yeah, just Florian has a good thing for that. It's got a good policy for Audit D that you can deploy for free.
Okay, same question. How many of you use an Audit D? Wow, that was okay. 1 out of everybody here. Virtual folks, like what? 10 out of
I'm not sure
5,000.
if that's a full one or just half of a
Half.
raise?
Is it at audit mode? We'll give you half. No.
It's deployed without policy, right?
Yeah. But so audit D, well, again, that's not actually there on some Linux systems by default. I mean,
True,
app install audit D, yum install audit D. I mean, it's not that hard to install. Configuring it's somewhat of a beast.
For things like the cloud, for example, right? Things such as MFA in AWS is free, right? So in Azure as well. So you have those also built-in controls that are just basic hygiene. Now, MFA can be bypassed, we all know, but a lot of things can be bypassed, right? But that's something that I believe it puts you into another level of security just by doing that basic, right? Like hygiene in the cloud, for example. Yeah.
I think from my experiences of like doing assessments of small to large companies, I tend to hyper focus on hygiene because honestly, there's a lot of stuff that can be blocked or detected without the SIM, without the EDR, without the next gen firewall, without the insert product here, or let's just call it what it is, the shiny box syndrome, right? I don't know if this has ever happened to you. You ever have where you get like a software license or a piece of hardware and it's purchased, but it's never implemented? It's been sitting on like the dock.
Shelfware.
Literal shelfware, right? Or maybe what's more common is somebody else in your organization bought it, but you're now in charge of getting it going. It's kind of the same concept of hygiene. You still got to research it, and like it could be the best of breed blah, and it's a paperweight until you actually implement it properly.
I keep finding organizations that buy the tool and only go 30% deep with what it can do as well. So now you've wasted all these resources and money buying it when you could have done it another way.
And that I think is one of those areas too, that when you find those items, whether it's software or it's hardware, now you have a new opportunity to be able to get a little bit more out of it. And you get, and even if it's not yourself, it's someone else on the team, and you just say, hey, in a little bit of downtime, identify 3 more things that we can do with this particular tool. You kind of put a cape around them as a team member and help them rise up through the ranks as well.
I think one thing this conference that I picked up on from like Roberto from your talk, and I know from Gene from speaking to you, we've mentioned some things that probably everybody's completely ignored because it's not cool. Roberto does tons of detection. He's got like the help project and all these other things. And well, he's just awesome. But he mentioned things like using the data for inventories, for informed decision-making. And Gene, I know you've got a background in this. You've got a lot in like the logging space. And in class, one of the things I'll talk about is we've got all this data coming in. Why don't we build inventories or drive our rule sets, firewalls? I don't care what it is, even EDR products. I can use the data from my logs to inform the decisions I make. But it seems like we never actually stop to do that. Why do you think that is? Totally open-ended, right?
I think it's because there's a perception challenge of we're always firefighting. I think a lot of organizations really want to see, especially their security team, if not almost the entire IT team, to be, running in with the hoses and putting the fire out and saving the day and things like this. And I think that's one of those challenges. How do we help change the perception of that type of viewpoint?
Yes, so I believe also it could be that people running those assessments to like drive, for example, something as, let's call it simple, but it's not as simple. But if you're starting a company, it should be a little simple, right? If you're starting your network, it's just the value and the impact of understanding what's running in your environment. For example, I believe that from a research perspective, researchers get very interested to understand the threat models around systems, which pushes you to actually understand what systems you have. That turns into an inventory. So for a lot of researchers, it's like, man, this is amazing. We're learning about every single thing that is happening, data available, how identities can access this, who cannot access. You start getting very, very passionate about it as a researcher, but the people in charge don't seem to understand the impact of doing that. You know what I mean? So I think that it's also a lack of understanding of how valuable that task is. And a lot of the researchers that go and try to understand it, in my opinion, understand it better than the person leading the project. That's what I've seen a lot in companies that I've been, working with and collaborating with. Yeah.
Kind of in the trenches versus strategic vision. Sometimes things get lost in there.
Yep.
In some aspects, for those of you who have never threat hunt before, it's kind of interesting because the first time you look at your own data and you're just like, you make a hypothesis and you dive into it, there's a lot of aha moments in there, even if you find nothing bad. Like, come on, can I get it? Yeah, that's totally true. Like, I don't know why every new client I get, when we go through their data, it's like, what is that? Aha, or that's really weird. Or like single sign-on agents for like next-gen firewalls and stuff. They'll do things that I teach in class, like that's malicious. But it's not, it's just their vendor's really weird way of doing something.
Never happened.
Yeah.
So one thing that I wanted to share too is that there is also value on trying to mix in the data that you collect on the network side, on the endpoint side, and trying to, usually the fight is either network or endpoint, right? But the answer is how they actually complement each other a lot. For example, Johnny in the logon sessions talk, right? He was talking about understanding the usage of built-in telemetry like Windows security event logs and using something like MDE to make it practical, available, right? Correlating all that knowledge. I think that usually the question, once again, besides network versus endpoint is, do I collect security built-in or Sysmon or MDE? So there's a lot of ors, but people don't take the time to understand how can they be actually complemented. And you can come up with some really cool correlations just by doing that type of analysis. So if you do that from the beginning, by understanding what you have from a data perspective, seeing what you can get out of some of those, like event categories, I think that you will be set for success when you build detections.
Yeah, so just kind of repeating that in a little bit different way. If we're saying we're trying to get security from the ground up, that's a fantastic exercise to get a bunch of heads in a room. And I'm a huge fan of like smart boards, whiteboards. But if I were to be like, oh, we have network data, dest IP, source IP, ports, right? And I have things like endpoint data, even like Sysmon. You can very easily all of a sudden be like, whoa, there's a network socket here. There's a network socket here. I can kind of infer the user and process and parent and command line, and then I can skip to registry, and then I can, but then you realize, oh, wow, that's not easy. Because how far I want to go down that rabbit hole depends on the solutions that I'm using. If they'll automatically do that for me, am I going to be writing scripts? And more importantly, do I even care enough to try to make it a project? We only have so much time, right? Let's kind of go back to those attack surface rules for a second, right? Attack surface rules, not a whole lot. It didn't seem like a whole lot of you folks were using it. I don't see it implemented a whole lot. Again, it's a hygiene item. So how would we go about even assessing, implementing, like what would that look like from a process to a technical implementation? Because can I just turn them all like, Azure gives me that secure risk score, says you don't use ASRs. I can just like, okay, on, and my risk score jumps up and I'm like, yeah.
Well, you can set it in audit mode, right? Which would be the first, even if you have like enable all, I mean, just by doing that exercise, I think just understanding first, not only what is triggering, but understanding what you get out of each alert, like the context from a data perspective. I think that exercise is valuable as a first step, right? Then you need to understand like how you can kind of fit or adapt those rules to whatever your environment is showing you from a audit mode perspective, right? So that's what I would do initially, and yeah.
And I think one of the things that you can do also with the results from that audit mode is also use that as an opportunity to go learn what these different business units internally, how they operate. And now you're bringing in a personal bridge between your department and other departments in the company. And you're going to be able to clarify, yeah, this really is something that's important or highly important, or no, it may not, should not be happening.
Something that I like about what was mentioned from firewalls, Windows firewalls, is the fact that there might be certain things that you might not want to block right away from the execution on the endpoint side, because it might make sense in your environment, but you can block it at the network layer, right? So you can start putting those two things together and come up with a strategy that will make sense for your organization, right? Not everybody would do that, but I like that having the control, once again, free built-in stuff that you can stop it at the execution layer or stop it at the network layer, right?
Yep. They're definitely complementary, but again,
Yeah.
when I teach what you just said, I feel like it's the most uncool slide in all my decks. Like I literally, I'll sit there and I'll geek out for 15 minutes on one slide that basically like, firewall logs. Woo! I can now use this to figure out how to lock down the HIPAA network, the PCI network. I can do it with, certain processes. I can do it at the network firewall. And everybody just looks at me like, boring. But honestly, like, and Brian, I kind of bring you on this because I know you've kind of been in that recently. The effectiveness of something as, I don't want to say oversimple as a firewall, network or endpoint, it can catch and prevent a whole slew of attacks. In fact, many of the ones that we've called out in attacks, like modern attacks on the slide decks, in my head, I'm just thinking, yeah, but if you did the internal firewall or the network firewall, that would have been blocked, that would have been blocked. And not that you're failing, it's just even some of the coolest modern attacks blocked by simple ASRs and endpoint firewall networks. So Brian, like you went through this process from both network and endpoint, and you had some challenges in there. You don't need to go into all the details on those, but like, what did you try? What didn't work? What did work? And kind of what did it look like?
Yeah, so we are going through a microsegmentation project right now, and we were like, yeah, let's use the Windows firewall, but it's really hard to manage with group policy. It doesn't scale really well. You have disparate organizations or sub-organizations within your responsibility that they operate differently, and collecting all that data and turning it on its head to see how they're talking is not the easiest thing. So in this case, I actually had to invest in an external tool, which made it a little bit easier, but just, I don't know, it's been successful in some cases, but not entirely, right? It's really hard. Admins need to connect on 445, but regular users don't. So how do you distinguish who's an admin and what machine they're supposed to connect from? And it's very complicated. Inventory is important for all of that.
I was just about to call out, well, if you had an inventory.
Yeah, I don't, top 1 and 2 controls, I don't like talking about them because I don't have them.
So something that you can do also, which I've seen companies like, for example, Palantir doing, and the reason why I call them out is because they have a lot of, good blog posts where they share their methodology. And for example, something that I was testing as well is how you can use the concept of SACLs. So SACLs, system access control lists. You can actually enable a SACL on, let's say, the SCM, the SCM manager, right? The SC manager, which controls the way how services are created, modified, query, etc. on endpoints. So when you do that, you can start understanding, for example, who is connecting to those servers, which would allow somebody to potentially move laterally and create a service, for example, right? So those type of controls would allow you to, have that additional context that then you can apply to a firewall rule, for example. So cycles are great to start auditing.
So what I just heard you say again is inventory.
Inventory, yes. But the concept of cycles is so to me is so powerful, but at the same time, it's something that we don't talk as much, right? A cycle could be applied to a registry, to a file, to an Active Directory object, for example, right? There is a lot of events that when you access an object, you won't get data that something was accessed unless you monitor the network and say, there is some LDAP traffic, right, going on in here. But if you start creating some of those kind of audit rules on some of those objects, I think that that's also very powerful. And once again, we're talking about what are the things that I would do right from the beginning to start protecting my environment, right?
So just again, repeating here, it's like you're intentionally putting rules in place to generate logs, to build an inventory.
That's correct.
That then drive your decision-making. You're
That's
making
correct.
informed decisions.
Decisions. Yep. With free tools.
That commercial works fine
commercial
for
works
this
like-
too, right?
Right.
I mean, it doesn't have to be free for this. But we either don't take the time to build that data
Yes.
up, we just go straight to decision-making.
That's correct.
And I have a completely unfair bias in this because I come in as a third party. I can assess, but my whole job is to not run with scissors, to Gene's point. Take the time and look at things. And when you're in the trenches, it's kind of hard to do that, but sometimes we just need to stop and,
Sometimes the best thing you can do is pump the brakes,
yeah.
slow it down just a little bit. Take a more thorough evaluation of what are my assets? How does business get done? And then implement something meaningful instead of always being this knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah. And what you'll find if you do some of these steps, you'll have fun with it too. Like you're doing SACLs. Those can be very boring.
Very boring.
They can be very boring.
But very fun to look into.
Sure, yeah, sure, all right. But like, everything in Windows can effectively be something you can apply in a SACL to. So you could put like certain files as file honey tokens.
Yep.
You can mark certain Active Directory objects as honey tokens, and that can help you find things like ransomware or Bloodhound or other reconnaissance tools. And it's actually a fairly simple thing, but as you start to talk with your team, kind of building this data and inventory to make decisions. If you, and actually we probably need to have this conversation here in a second, you'll start to theorize possibilities. And where my mind just went, and I said, we'll come back to this in a second. If we're starting from the ground up, this never gets talked to about, but it actually needs to be part of figuring out data discovery of your team. Because if your team doesn't get along, I don't know if you've ever realized this, but if your team don't get along, your projects do really horrible. They don't make progress, or they take 4 times longer, or they take 4 times longer before they get canceled because you've moved on to something else, because it's like the strategic vision just keeps changing because no one's actually in charge. Everybody's in charge, or, you know, there's a lot of different scenarios. So like culturally, if I'm starting a new company, new hire, maybe you're now the SOC manager, you're the whoever. How do you handle the people problem? And I don't want to call it problem, the people situation. People
So-
are problems.
In my organization, we recently just introduced like the security by committee idea in our SOC team, where we have a board of things we all want to do and things you want to work on. And we then, as a group, we triage all those things together and come to a consensus to say, all right, this is what we're going to work on next. Or, hey, if you got 20% free time next week, just pluck it off the board and do it. And as a group, we come together. This is active. Let's review it. It still makes sense. Nope, let's kill it. Hey, let's continue going. And then constantly prioritize and deprioritize things based on what the team thinks we should work on, because they're all experts at different things. I have a detection engineer that knows, how to detect things, and I have a guy that's really good at server hardware, and I have a junior analyst that, is seeing alerts all day. And we're going to shift what we do based on what the guys are seeing, or the individuals are seeing.
So what you're saying there actually reminds me, and I kind of put this in Slack, OKRs. Has anybody heard of OKRs? It tends not to be directly an IT thing at all, but it's a way of aligning like the vision, either of the company or the team, down through the whole stack of upper to lower management. But it's to induce buy-in and decision-making, and specifically focusing on things that actually matter and being willing to cut them when they don't, without the intent of firing people for low performance and stuff like that. Like, it's not necessarily bonus and stuff like that. That actually has worked substantially well for me. And it's kind of that committee aspect of getting that buy-in.
Yeah, hit me up on Slack in 30 days. We'll see how well it goes. Because we just started this a couple weeks ago.
It's actually worked pretty well so far. Yeah. But getting that is interesting. Like, I think it was Fleetus and his thing. You were talking a lot about getting along with folks and burnout, and all of that wraps into getting a well-oiled team. Like, even like, I guarantee you guys have team members that are working like 60+ hours a week. Like, what do you do?
Well, that
Keep up the work, Gene. You're doing great.
I love it.
Here's some more money.
so that's interesting, because For example, something that I think it was super helpful for me when I was working at Capital One, and hopefully if my, if my boss is looking at this, watching this. So something that she told me once was that, you are already a superstar, and you don't have to be always a superstar, right? You can actually be a great employee, a great researcher. You can do everything that you're supposed to be doing. Don't try to just keep it at the level that you might believe is what you need to do. That's what she described it as a superstar level, that sometimes we try to feel that we need to achieve. But just hearing it from my boss telling me that she is super happy with me just being a great researcher, accomplishing everything that I'm doing, and just doing a little bit more. But the superstar is not as needed all the time. And I think that that was super helpful because it kind of allowed me to feel that maybe I don't have to go the extra 60 hours, this week, and things like that. So sometimes coming from someone that you respect a lot in your team, it really helps. I mean, like my wife can tell me you're working too much, and then I'll be like, sure, yeah, okay. If you're listening to this,
You need to work on that
yes.
response a little bit.
Yeah, my wife is watching this. I'm sorry, babe. But when you hear it from somebody else, right? Usually when you hear it from a friend or from somebody that I don't know, like
It's validation.
it's a little different,
and it's permission to breathe.
Exactly. I don't know, like that was super important for me. And it's just sharing my own experience, right? I don't know what works for others, but that was huge. The other thing also for me to help others in a team, something that I like that I believe the company Target actually talked about in the past threat hunting summit, which is something that I've done too, is always allow curiosity and creativity in those tasks such as a hunting engagement, right? If you're doing huntings or hunts, there is always going to be predefined hunts that you have for the month, for the year. Like if you're very organized and you know how you're going to do it for the whole year, but always leave room for that curiosity, because that's how you keep also your team, in my opinion, alive, right? Where you could say, you know what? I've been trying to dive into how to bypass ASR rules. And maybe you're never gonna get there, but you as a researcher, you're trying to do it. And sometimes you use your extra time because you wanna get there, because your team is not on the same page. That's how you feel, right? They're not on the same page as me. If you allow that curiosity, that creativity in percentage of your time in your team, I think that you're going to keep the team engaged and healthy as well, and not letting them go the too much extra time, because they can still accomplish it in the company.
And I know some of you are like, this isn't designing security from ground up, but I got to tell you, this is actually exactly that. If you want to have security be highly effective, I mean, we can go technical and we can get down in the trenches. That's honestly not what you need to hear. You need to hear is things like these, that we tend to deal with technology as a technology problem. It is not a technology problem. Technology
I was going to
helps.
say one of the most important things that you can do is have a cohesive team, because not just burnout, but if you have, I don't remember who the presenter was, but they started and someone left 1 week after another week after another week. And all of a sudden as a team leader, your focus is completely off on, how do I start interviewing enough people? How do I onboard these individuals? How
You're
do I
designing
ramp up?
security from the ground up at that point.
Yeah, you really are. So one of the most important things, even outside of the technology, it doesn't matter how many shiny objects there are that you have to play with. If you don't have that cohesive team that's working together, you don't have anything.
And kind of addressing this from a different aspect, because most of what we said is kind of controlled from the top down. It's a management level, like your boss took you aside and you really felt secure and you went out and conquered the world. A lot of you aren't in that position. Yeah, that's for sure, right? There's some story there, right? You can actually handle some of these things at the rock bottom. Like Brian, there's some nights, and Brian does not work for me, by the way. He should. We tried to. I couldn't pay him enough. But Brian, there's some nights that I can clearly tell, like, dude, get the heck off your laptop. Like, that head's getting red. You're just burning up. Like, it's like a matchstick, right? Apologize.
You're good. Yeah, it's true.
And he does the same thing to me. And with my employees, what I've learned is if I start to teach a employee that, and then they start to do that to their coworkers, I don't have to do it as much. And honestly, then I kind of am the big bad wolf that they don't necessarily want to open up to sometimes, because there's that perception sometimes, but they do it internally and laterally. Like, Gene, I've seen you work with Scott. You guys, you're from two different aspects, similar field, but you build each other up, you work on it. And it's a mentor role without officially saying, hey, I'm your mentor. It's like the buddy system, but you're really bi-directional mentors.
Something that also is very helpful is to share how you manage your time as a researcher. Because, for example, recently I just met a couple of people from Microsoft, right? They just got hired. And just by doing those conversations, hey, how do you do your every day? Could you tell me some of your time? And I found out that a lot of people do the same thing that I do, but some people actually do even better, right? They start adding a few things that make sense, right? How you can start accomplishing more by using these other tools. Like there's even applications that would help you. So opening up to other researchers also, like if you don't want to talk to your boss or your boss is not approaching you, right? At least talk to others that might not be in your same team, right? But just sharing your time management skills, it's good, because I think that you will be able also to understand how much others are accomplishing by following in a specific pattern. And you might want to try some of that sometimes, and it might be good.
Do you also learn from that when to respect not to bother them?
Yes, of course.
Lies.
Yeah.
That's a lie. Yeah. Everybody's done the training. Oh, knock, knock. Is this a good time to talk? How many of y'all actually do that? And don't lie. Like, I'm just, Brian, how you doing? I need you to solve this right now. I might have done that a few times. It's hard, and you have to stop and go back to that. Let's swing this back to something a little bit more technical, although I don't feel guilty at all for where we're going with this. If I were to start in front of a whiteboard, blank canvas, we've got ASRs, those don't whiteboard very well. Okay, they just don't. What would we start to draw with the team when we're trying to envision what security controls we want to overlay on like a standard network map with maybe cloud? I've got some containers in both sides. I've got desktops, workstops. Maybe it's all one segment or micro segmented. We got to figure all that out. What do we whiteboard?
Feel like you need to get your tablet up here with the whiteboard. You missed an opportunity.
John, no. I was going to whiteboard, but we got 10-ish.
There's a lot to unpack there. So you kind of just drew the topology, but you don't have the different boundaries drawn on there. And so you're asking for that, like, what do we have? These security boundaries and tools and detections and stuff. We have to kind of understand our threat landscape first, right? And say, okay, is a lot of our data in the cloud and it's the most sensitive data we have? Well, let's focus on cloud-centric security solutions first. Not necessarily first, but prioritize those, right? But if I was taking it as a holistic view, like I need data to see things. I need to be able to see what my problems are, where they live, so I can then prescribe a control to protect those things. Right?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar where it's assess the value and assess risk. And then if there are glaring opportunities of, maybe we should consider a second segment, maybe, some low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
Which again, I'm hearing we're going right back to inventory of, because do I do umbrella protection that everybody's treated the same? Do I do data-centric protections where I'm assessing different assets values and then put controls against that?
And I think one of the things that we're adding into the concept of inventory is not just the technology of the hardware and the software, but also inventory the value of this And you know, we've talked about this in class, you know, it's like, what's the most important tool that you have from a technology perspective? And if you talk to different people in the company, they're going to have different perceptions. Well, email's the most important. We can't live without email. Well, okay, so email's more important than all of your customer records? Well,
Yes.
no.
Yes.
So really understanding, you know, the business operation and what happens is like, we go into a bank and you worked at Capital One, right? So you ask a banker, how do you define risk? And a banker will tell you someone defaulting on their loan. That is risk to a bank. And then you start spewing a whole bunch of technology stuff and their eyes glaze over, they lay down on the couch for a nap, they check out. And so part of this inventory is what's the value of what? And what is the risk associated with it? What happens to the business if this stops working? How far can I hold your arm behind your back before you moan, before you start to cry, before you pass out?
You're a little brutal, Gene.
I'm a brute.
Look at that grin, like, oh man.
I've so bad wanted to twist your arm that hard. You know,
Wow, Gene, that got dark quick.
mean.
So, and that's, I think if you were to start on a whiteboard, I think you would draw what you know, and then all of a sudden you're going to find out there's a lot I don't know.
Something that I also would add to complement all these great ideas is the identity life cycle in your organization, right? It's like, who is going to be accessing what, with what permissions, even though it sounds very complex. If you're just starting to draw that, I think it makes sense to do it manually, but once you start deploying things, then you can start continuously monitoring the life cycle of how this identity is, you know, moving around, how it's being accessing things, etc. Following on the concept of understanding also what works for, you know, certain environments. So for example, I don't know if this applies, but when I was working in another company, understanding that certain systems could not handle to ship all the event telemetry that we want, because we want more data. So we identify right away that the pipe and how this data was being sent, it was not going to happen. So understanding those challenges is also very important, because you might set up your environment and build the best SIM, the best data pipeline, and all of a sudden you turn stuff and then nothing is flowing the way it's supposed to.
Or you crash something.
Or you crash something.
Yep.
That's something that happened while doing some hunting and, you know, doing research. So that's what I've learned from those mistakes. So I would say understand the capacity and how your system handles that.
Hey, Scott, how does it work when you send tons and tons of data over satellite links? Oh, poorly. Oh, I just thought you turned on compression and it was fine. Okay. Yeah, you just keep going to detection. I see how it is.
Yeah.
No. I'm actually really glad you brought up identity, because I think all too often we whiteboard out and we're like segmentation, and we're really talking network. There's internet or your cloud subnets. There's your internal on-premise subnets across multiple data centers and small offices, but identity, like identity management solutions, I feel like need a lot more love. And that is one thing I would want to assess from the start is, how can I centrally control my identities and my MFA, and I can wrap policies even conditionally, and how does that even fit? Is it network-based? Is it geographic-based? Can I get down to the process level? Can I get down to the endpoint? Like answering those, and then really that's almost like its own little whiteboard session, because it doesn't fit well on a network diagram, but you can do stuff on that. Okay, everybody just agreed with that. We're good. Mic drop. All right.
So open source tools like, you know, Bloodhound, for example, right, from Spectre Ops team. I mean, they're doing a great job keeping it open source, and they also have their own solutions, right, for the enterprise side. But it's just now it's achievable to do it for free if you wanted to, if you're just starting, right, and then you adapt as you grow as a company, how complex it becomes, right? So.
I think another thing from the ground up would be actually looking at things like, I don't know, vulnerability scans. oh, it says that's bad. Why? You actually learn a lot just from reading those, even if you're scratching your head like, I don't really know what that means. That means research it some more or ask someone. You learn a lot. And there's other things. You brought up Bloodhound, which honestly made me think of Ping Castle. I don't know. Ping Castle is awesome. You point it at Active Directory and it magically says bad stuff will happen and Bloodhound will own your soul.
Yeah, that's another tool.
I want to touch on the vulnerability management thing, right? It's not just finding the vulnerabilities, but it's finding obsolete software and then finding breakdowns in your patch teams. Like, oh, I have 40 versions of Chrome. Why? Like what process in SCCM broke? It said, you're not patching Chrome, you're probably not patching something else that's probably more important. Like you find these operational problems as well, not just pure security risks.
Assuming you're actually doing a good job of patching, period, even basic Windows patching.
That's true.
Anybody struggle with that one? Okay. Yeah, it's everybody. Macs, like, and especially like, how many of you are cross-platform? Okay. How many of you have containers? Which, even though they're technically still Windows or Linux underneath the hood, patching those is different because you're patching the image. How many of you scan your image? I mean, we don't want to go into that, but you now need a solution. Ideally, it'd be like, I have one solution that will scan across all of this. How's that work for you? Anybody have like one vulnerability management patching tool for Windows, Linux, Mac, and containers? Yeah, it doesn't exist. So now in our ground up discussion, we got to figure out, okay, what's the path to least resistance or accepting defeat, right? To control these. Let's be clear. I say that because there's just some things that politically, it ain't gonna happen. I don't have the time. I don't have the political power. I don't have the buy-in. You know what we're gonna do? We're gonna patch Windows and everything else will suffer. Yeah, I'm joking here, but I'm really not. It happens. So like, how Mr. Microsoft, sorry, you're in Microsoft. Is it your Microsoft solution and patch containers and all that stuff? And
Sure.
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He's just joined the sales engineering team. If you need a quote,
course,
reach out
of
to
course.
Roberto.
Of course.
Anything I say is not Microsoft.
It's too late. You should have said that in the beginning.